aitah for telling my stepdad if he doesn't understand that I do not see him as my dad. After 20 years then I don't know what it will take to make him accept it. But I'm done dealing with his delusions. I didn't plan to say it the way I did. I didn't even plan to say it that day. But sometimes a sentence lives in you for years, growing heavier every time you swallow it, until one ordinary moment becomes the last place it can stay hidden. It was a Sunday afternoon, quiet in the way only family houses are quite thick with history, cluttered with unspoken rules. The smell of overcooked coffee hung in the air. The television was on, muted, showing a game no one was watching. My mom was in the kitchen, moving things around without really doing anything, and my stepdad sat across from me, smiling in that familiar, self-satisfied way that always meant he was about to say something he believed settled everything. "You know," he said casually, "after all these years, I think it's safe to say I raised you like my own." Something inside me went still. I stared at the table between us, the scratches in the wood, the water ring no one ever bothered to clean, my hands resting in my lap, clenched tighter than I realized. Like his own, had said versions of that sentence my entire life. At graduations, at family gatherings, in conversations where my real father's name was carefully avoided, like it might contaminate the room. And every time, I'd let it slide, because correcting him felt cruel, because my mom looked relieved when he said it, because everyone else seemed to agree that time alone should have rewritten reality. But 20 years hadn't changed the truth. They'd only buried it deeper. "I never called you Dad," I said quietly. He chuckled, waving a hand. "You don't have to say it. It's what matters in your heart." That was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, just final. I looked up at him and felt something harden in my chest, not anger, not hatred, but exhaustion so complete it felt like clarity. "That's the problem," I said. "You keep deciding what's in my heart." The room shifted. My mom froze mid-step. He frowned, confused but still confident. "What are you talking about?" I took a breath. One slow breath. I'd waited to decades to take it. "If you still don't understand that I don't see you as my dad," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "then I don't know what it would take to make you accept it. But I'm done dealing with this version of reality you've invented." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was stunned. My stepdad's smile faded inch by inch, replaced by something tight and wounded. "That's a terrible thing to say," he replied. "After everything I've done for you." There it was, the debt, the unspoken contract I never signed. And suddenly, memories lined up in my head, not of fatherhood but of obligation. Him correcting teachers when they asked about my dad. Him introducing himself as my father without asking me. Him getting offended when I mentioned my real dad as if biology were an insult. Had been present, yes. But presence isn't the same as permission. "I never denied what you did," I said. "But doing things for a child doesn't make you their parent if that child never felt seen by you." My mom finally spoke. "You didn't mean it like that," she said softly to him. Then to me, sharper. "Why are you doing this now?" "Because now I'm tired," I thought. "Because now I'm an adult and the lie doesn't serve anyone anymore." But I didn't say that. I said because pretending hasn't made it true. It's just made it heavier. My stepdad stood up so suddenly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I loved you," he said, voice raised now. "I treated you like my own flesh and blood. And you needed me to confirm that for you," I replied. "Over and over. You never asked how I felt. You just decided." His face flushed. "You're rewriting history." "No," I said. "I'm finally telling it from my side." The argument escalated quickly after that. Words stacked on top of words. Accusations disguised as hurt, hurt disguised as righteousness. My mom crying, telling me to apologize, telling him to calm down, trying to glue together something that had never actually fused. Eventually, I left. I drove for nearly an hour with no destination, my chest tight, my hands shaking on the wheel. Not because I'd said something wrong, but because I'd said something true after years of being told. My truth was inconvenient. That night, my phone exploded with messages. Family members telling me I'd been cruel, telling me I should be grateful, telling me he meant well. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked why it took me 20 years to say it. And that's when the doubt crept in. Was I heartless for refusing to validate his belief? Was I ungrateful for not accepting the role he chose for himself? Or was I finally allowed to define my own relationships, even if it shattered someone else's illusion? I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his face when I said the words, the hurt, the disbelief, the anger, and underneath it all, one question kept circling louder than the rest. After 20 years of being told who he was to me, was I really the asshole for finally saying who he wasn't? The next morning came with that hollow, twirly light that makes everything feel unresolved. My phone lay face down on the nightstand, buzzing every few minutes with messages I didn't have the energy to read. I already knew what they would say. They always did. I went to work anyway. Muscle memory carried me through the routine: coffee, keys, locking the door, while my mind stayed anchored in that living room, in the scrape of the chair against the floor, in my mother's face folding in on itself as if she were trying to hold two opposing truths at once. By noon, I couldn't pretend anymore. I opened my messages. My aunt had written first a long paragraph about how family is complicated and how men should love differently, and how I should consider how my words might have wounded him. My cousin followed with something shorter and sharper. You didn't have to humiliate him like that. Then my mom, last of all, her message blinking at me like a warning light. He hasn't eaten since yesterday. He locked himself in the bedroom. I don't know what to do. The familiar tug of responsibility tightened in my chest. Even after everything, the expectation was still there. Fix this, make it better, take the words back and restore the balance. I typed, deleted, typed again. I didn't humiliate him. I finally wrote, I told the truth. I'm sorry has hurting, but I can't pretend anymore. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. You could have said it more gently, she replied. He loves you. The word love sat between us like an accusation. I put my phone away and finished the day in a fog. Every sound felt too loud. Every question from coworkers felt invasive. By the time I got home, the exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. That evening, my stepdad called. I almost didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the screen, my heart pounding not with fear, but with the knowledge that whatever came next would shape the future of our relationship, for better or worse. I picked up. Hello. His voice was hoarse, not angry, not performative, just worn down. I didn't sleep, he said. No greeting, no preamble. I keep replaying what you said. I leaned against the kitchen counter, closing my eyes. I figured, do you know how humiliating it is, he continued, to find out after 20 years that you were just pretending? I wasn't pretending, I said. I was surviving. That made him go quiet. I showed up, he said after a moment. I went to every school event. I put food on the table. I stayed when I didn't have to. I know, I replied, and am not erasing that. But none of that automatically made you my dad. It made you an adult in my life. There's a difference. He exhaled sharply. You don't get to decide that alone. I do, I said, my voice steady. It's my relationship, my feelings. I'm the only one who gets to define them. There it was, the core of it, the thing he had never accepted. You're punishing me for wanting to belong, he said. No, I answered. I'm asking you to stop taking ownership of something that was never yours to claim. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. You know, he said finally, everyone sees me as your father. That's part of the problem, I replied. They see what you tell them, not what I feel. His tone hardened then, the old defensiveness creeping back in. So, what am I to you? Nothing? I hesitated. Not because I didn't know, but because saying it would hurt. You're my mother's husband, I said. You're someone who was around. You're someone I respect for certain things. But you are not my father, and I need you to stop trying to overwrite that. You're tearing this family apart, he said bitterly. I felt something in me settle, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. No, I said. I'm refusing to hold it together with a lie. He hung up without saying goodbye. The fallout was immediate and brutal. My mom stopped calling for a while. When she did, her voice was distant, careful, like she was speaking to a stranger. Family dinners were canceled. Invitations quietly disappeared. I became the unspoken topic no one wanted to address directly. And yet beneath the grief, beneath the guilt, there was relief. For the first time, I wasn't managing his expectations. I wasn't softening my language to protect his self-image. I wasn't shrinking to make his story more comfortable. Weeks passed. One night, my mom finally came over. She sat at my table, twisting a napkin in her hands. He feels like you erased him, she said. I met her gaze. I never asked asked him to build his identity around being my father. She sighed. He doesn't know who he is without that. That's not my responsibility, I said gently. I was a child. One didn't get to choose that role for him. She looked at me for a long time, eyes wet. I should have protected you better. The admission stunned me. I should have listened when you were younger, she continued. But it was easier to believe that time would fix it. I swallowed hard. Time doesn't fix being unheard. She nodded slowly, as if learning something too late. A month later, my stepdad sent me an email. Not a call. Not a confrontation. An email. I don't understand how you can feel this way after all these years, it began. But I'm starting to accept that understanding may not be required for respect. I don't agree with you, but I will stop calling myself your father if that's what you need. No apology. No acknowledgement of harm. But something close to surrender. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, "Thank you for respecting my boundary. That's all I asked for. Nothing more. Nothing less." The relationship didn't heal overnight. It didn't become warm or easy, but it became honest. And that honest, quiet, uncomfortable, incomplete felt like the first real thing we'd ever shared. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't living inside someone else's delusion, and I finally felt like myself. Months passed, and with them came a strange recalibration of reality. Life didn't return to what it had been before, not even close, but it didn't collapse either. Instead, it rearranged itself around the truth I'd finally allowed to exist. At first, the silence was the loudest thing. Family group chats stayed active without me. Photos were shared secondhand. Updates reached me filtered through other people's voices. I was no longer central, no longer expected to smooth things over or play the role everyone preferred. And that hurt more than I expected. Not because I regretted what I said, but because it confirmed something I'd always suspected. My value in the family had been tied to how much discomfort I was willing to absorb. When I stopped absorbing it, the structure shifted. My stepdad kept his distance. At family gatherings, when we happened to be in the same space, he was polite but guarded. He didn't introduce himself as my father anymore. Instead, he used my name or avoided introductions altogether. The absence of that label felt heavy, but also oddly respectful. For the first time, he wasn't rewriting my story out loud. Still, the tension lingered beneath the surface. At my cousin's wedding, we stood near each other during the reception, neither of us quite sure where to look. When someone asked how we were related, there was a pause, a brief, awkward gap in the conversation. "I'm married to their mom," he said. Not proudly, not bitterly, just factually. I felt something loosen in my chest. Later that night, after a few drinks and too much time alone with his thoughts, he approached me on the patio. The music from inside thumped faintly through the doors. "I keep thinking about something you said," he told me, staring out into the dark. "About me deciding what was in your heart." I didn't respond right away. "I didn't realize how often I spoke over you," he continued. "I thought if I said it enough times, it would become true." "That's not how relationships work," I said quietly. "No," he agreed. "It's how control works." The word hung between us, uncomfortable and undeniable. "I didn't mean to control you," he added quickly. "I know," I said, "but intent doesn't erase impact." He nodded slowly, as if repeating the sentence to himself. "I built a version of myself around being your dad," he said. "And when you took that away, it felt like you erased 20 years of my life." "I didn't erase them," I replied. "I just refused to lie about what they meant to me." He swallowed. "I don't know who I am without that role." "That's something you have to figure out," I said. "Not something I can give you." For the first time, he didn't argue. After that night, something subtle changed. He stopped pushing for closeness. He stopped fishing for reassurance. Instead, he treated me like an adult with autonomy, not a character in his narrative. My relationship with my mother shifted too. We spoke more honestly than we ever had. She admitted how much she had relied on him to fill a gap she didn't know how to explain to me. As a child, how she'd hoped love could be grown through repetition. "I thought you'd wake up one day and feel it," she said once. "I didn't realize you'd been waking up every day feeling trapped." I didn't blame her, not anymore. Blame felt too easy, too shallow for something this layered. But I didn't absolve her either. Understanding didn't require erasing accountability. As time went on, I noticed something unexpected. I felt lighter. Not happier exactly, but clearer. My relationships outside the family improved. I stopped over-explaining myself. I stopped apologizing for boundaries. Therapy sessions that once circled the same unresolved resentment began moving forward. I wasn't carrying a secret anymore. One evening, nearly a year after that Sunday afternoon, my stepdad asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. We sat across from each other at a quiet diner, the kind with cracked vinyl seats and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since dawn. "I've been in therapy," he said after a while. I raised my eyebrows slightly but said nothing. "My therapist asked me why it mattered so much that you saw me as your father," he continued. "And I didn't have a good answer. Just fear, ego, a need to be needed." He looked at me then, really looked. "I don't expect you to ever call me Dad," he said. "I don't even expect closeness. But I want you to know that I'm trying to let go of the fantasy I built. And I'm sorry I made you carry it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. But it was real." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. We didn't suddenly become close. We probably never will. But the relationship found its actual shape, smaller, quieter, honest. No illusions. No forced roles. And as I walked out into the cool night air afterward, I realized something that settled deeply and permanently inside me. I wasn't cruel for telling the truth. I wasn't ungrateful for refusing a role I never chose. And I wasn't wrong for being done with someone else's delusion. I was just finished pretending. And that, finally, felt like freedom. Years didn't pass quietly after that. They passed in layers. At first, everything stayed delicate, like a bone that had healed wrong and could break again if handled carelessly. Holidays were negotiated instead of assumed. Phone calls were shorter, more intentional. My stepdad no longer filled silences with declarations about how things were, but the absence of those statements left a different kind of tension behind. What surprised me most was how often other people tried to reopen the wound for him. Friends of the family would say things like, "Well, he basically raised you," or "blood isn't everything," with the confidence of people who had never lived inside the dynamic they were summarizing. They spoke as if proximity automatically created intimacy, as if time alone could overwrite emotional reality. I stopped correcting them, not because I agreed, but because I no longer needed to defend myself. That was one of the first real changes I noticed. I didn't feel compelled to explain my truth anymore. It existed whether others acknowledged it or not. My stepdad, however, struggled longer. There were moments, small, almost unnoticeable, when he slipped. A comment phrased too familiarly. A story told with himself cast as dad out of habit. Each time he would catch himself halfway through, stop, clear his throat, and redirect. At first, the pauses felt awkward. Later, they felt respectful. But respect doesn't erase grief. One evening, almost 2 years after the argument that started everything, my mom called me late. Her voice was careful, tired in a way that suggested she had been holding something an all day. "Has not angry anymore," she said. "Has just sad." I didn't respond immediately. "He says he feels like he spent 20 years building something that doesn't belong to him," she continued. "Like he invested in a future that was never his to claim." "That's because he did," I said gently. "I know," she whispered, "but knowing doesn't make it hurt less." After we hung up, I sat with that for a long time, because here was the part no one wanted to say out loud. His pain was real, and it still wasn't mine to fix. That was the hardest boundary to hold, not against anger, but against sympathy. Around that time, I started unpacking memories differently, not as evidence for an argument, but as pieces of my own story I'd never fully examined. I remembered being 8 years old and introducing him to a friend as my mom's husband, then being corrected later in the car. I remembered how praise from him always felt conditional, tied to how well I fit the role he imagined for me. I remembered the quiet resentment I couldn't name back then, the sense that I was performing gratitude instead of feeling it. None of those memories were dramatic. There was no abuse, no cruelty that would make the situation easy to explain to outsiders. And that was the problem. When harm is subtle, people expect you to tolerate it indefinitely. My stepdad and I eventually settled into something that resembled a distant truce. We spoke on birthdays. We exchanged brief messages on holidays. Sometimes, if the room felt neutral enough, we could even have a real conversation about work, about books, about things that didn't require emotional labels. Once Once, during one of those conversations, he said something that surprised me. "I think I confused obligation with love," he admitted. "I thought if I did everything right, I'd earn the title." "You can't earn a relationship someone didn't choose," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I know that now. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't closure. But it was growth. And growth, I learned, is often quiet and incomplete." The rest of the family adjusted too, though not all at once. Some accepted the new reality without comment. Others continued to test it, slipping into old language as if hoping repetition might still work. Each time, I let it pass, not because it didn't matter but because I no longer needed their validation. One night, years later, I realized something unsettling and freeing at the same time. I barely thought about the conflict anymore. It wasn't that it no longer mattered. It was that it no longer defined me. The anger had burned itself out. The guilt had lost its grip. What remained was clarity. I hadn't rejected him out of cruelty. I hadn't erased his role out of spite. I hadn't broken the family by naming the truth. I had simply stopped participating in a story that was never mine. And in doing so, I gave myself permission to build relationships based on consent instead of expectation, honesty instead of endurance. If there was a cost, it was the loss of an illusion. But the gain was something far more durable, a life where I no longer had to pretend. The ending didn't arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a perfect apology. It arrived quietly, the way most real endings do. Years after that first argument, I found myself back in my mother's house for a small family gathering. Nothing formal, no holiday pressure, just coffee, conversation, and the soft hum of familiarity that no longer felt dangerous. My stepdad sat across from me at the table, older now, slower. The sharp certainty he once carried had dulled into something more reflective. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully, as if aware they could still shape more than he intended. At one point, someone asked about family traditions, and the conversation drifted toward fathers. My stepdad didn't look at me. He didn't insert himself into my story. He simply listened, and that was when I knew something fundamental had changed. Later, as people filtered out and the house grew quiet, he approached me in the hallway. "I won't ever fully understand how you felt," he said, "but I understand now that understanding isn't a requirement for respecting you." I nodded. That's all I needed. There was no embrace, no sudden closeness, just a shared acknowledgement of reality as it was, not as either of us once wanted it to be. As I drove home that night, I thought about how long I'd feared this moment, how I'd imagined the truth destroying everything. Instead, it had stripped away what was false and left something smaller but solid. I realized then that I hadn't lost a father. I'd reclaimed myself. I didn't owe anyone a role I never chose. I didn't owe gratitude for an identity imposed on me. And I wasn't cruel for refusing to live inside someone else's fantasy. The truth had cost me comfort, ease, and the approval of people who preferred silence over honesty. But it had given me something better, peace. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough.